Stanley and Dimitri and Mr. Fishman. Oh, goodness. And Cheetah. Mr. Fishman, I like that hat. That is a cool hat. How are you doing today, sir? And Cheetah, it is good to see you again. I hope you are doing well. Mr. Fishman, how's life treating you?
So far, so good. I'm building a chicken coop and
Nice.
planting some gardens, and yeah, life's good, man. How are you?
I'm doing fine, sir. How are you going to keep out the foxes? Oh, wait, out in your way, you may have foxes. Is it coyotes that you have to worry about more
Coyotes.
so?
Coyote,
Yeah.
that's literally exactly the problem I'm working on right now. I'm thinking I'm gonna put like hardware cloth around the perimeter, so they don't burrow under. And then I don't know, maybe electric fence around the whole thing is probably the surest bet. I don't know. If you have any ideas, let me know.
Yeah, we have coyote problems as well. This is like drones. You can use drones like at night to kind of chase out coyotes or to chase them. So drones actually work. I'm not going to, hello. I'm not going to tell you that you should install weaponry to your drones at night to automatically, because I think that's illegal. But I will suggest that it might be awesome. I'll let you decide. Maybe a paintball gun or something like that. That can work. Smells. I know people who use a lot of exactly. Awesome trumps legal, Matthew. I completely agree with you.
This is how it begins, man.
This is how it
the
begins.
start.
I've actually, and when I did wrestling for a bunch of years, we did a lot of paintball. And I always am like, man, I can't imagine being out in the abandoned cars where there were like drones with paintball guns that you had to dodge and different things like that. That would have been amazing back in my wrestling days and different things. Yeah, I do think sometimes actually like trying to make a chicken coop and having like, oh crap, how do I keep out the coyotes? Oh crap, do I make an electric fence? There's actually something intellectually really important about that, precisely because you learn with material reality all of the things you can't possibly think up until you do it, and then it smacks you in the face. And there's actually like an advantage to the cruelty of reality. Like, so you spend all these, like, we're putting out Belonging again soon, which I hope doesn't suck. We'll find out. But, there's something about, like, the cruelty of reality that actually almost is good for the intellectual life, because you're like, wow, reality doesn't care. You work really hard on your chicken coop and the coyotes are still going to eat it. Whereas it's funny when you, like, write a book, there's no coyotes that's going to, like, destroy your chapter. And in one way, that's lovely because you can just kind of work peacefully on it. But in another way, it's terrible, because if your argument is bad, it's not like reality will force you to realize it's bad until you put it out, and then you get reviews on Amazon that are 1 star and people are like, this guy doesn't even know who Philip Reef is. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. And I always think about how there's actually almost an advantage to that encounter with reality. And the same with like rock climbing, like when you're climbing the side of a mountain, if you miss, you fall to your death. There's a great cruelty to it. But then you actually know if you're good with rock climbing, for example, because like you made it to the top. Whereas when you write a book, it is an interest. Like I was just thinking about that because it's a hay cutting season, like with Belonging again coming out, like the difference between the experience of cutting a field and writing a book. So it's interesting that you talk about the chicken coop. And I actually think there can be a disadvantage for intellectuals not to have the experience of trying to make a chicken coop and bringing that mental frame to writing a book, because you don't realize you almost need that, or it's like inevitable to help you think. So those are thoughts that your comments make me think of.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree. You need the chicken coop to put you in your place a little bit. What was I gonna say? I don't know. I lost my thought. Somebody else.
Okay, so the intellectual needs a chicken coop. I completely agree with that. Without the chicken coop, it's almost like the chicken coop keeps you from falling into the idol of the ego, as Mr. Stanley has been talking about as well, where the ego is kind of an idol, where the chicken's like, wow, my ego that thinks that it's always like a check and balance to the ego, because you realize that the coyotes get into your chicken coop, and that's actually almost healthier, because it reminds you of, oh, you think you're all big and bad, but you can't even freaking raise chickens. You thought you could, right? Yeah, nah, freaking coyote ate them all. Whereas writing a book, I can really see it though, because like writing a book, it's so much easier to say this book is amazing, it's ultimate, there are no conflicts in the argument and different things, and your ego gets bigger and bigger until you release the book. But then it's like 5 years later and you've had the ego built all that time, and then it's like almost too late, where it's almost like, I'm almost wondering now if it's like decentralization versus centralization, where like when you're dealing with physical reality, your ego, you're like, I'm really good at raising animals, but like 5 days later you fail at it. So your ego only gets ever so big. Whereas when you do abstract work, I wonder if it's almost like easier to get a big ego because it takes so long before you get to the place, before the project's put in the world and people critique it. And by that time, you've created all sorts of psychological self-defense mechanisms to discredit anyone that dislikes your book versus not. So it would be interesting to kind of compare the way the ego can develop, say, when building a chicken coop versus when writing a book or something like that, because it seems like centralization versus decentralization almost.
Well, the way you might put this in like VC venture, like capital kind of discourse would be that when you're writing a book, you're setting up a really, really long feedback loop for yourself. And the way that learning happens is you try to accelerate the feedback loop. You make it shorter and you try to make it more manageable, and then you accelerate it so that the feedback loop of try, get feedback that you can then process and do something with, you make that loop shorter. And so the problem with a book is that it's a really long feedback loop. And so you wait a really long time to get new information that you can then adjust your behavior on. So that's a one way I would translate what you're saying.
That's an interesting point. And it's almost like if you're doing abstract work, and I'll give it to Mr. Fishman, you almost have to intentionally create shorter feedback loops. And yet you also almost don't want to do them too short, because if you have people critiquing you when it's too short, then you like lose hope because they're attacking you too soon. And Dimitri, that is the best background I've ever freaking seen. Oh my gosh, Zizek's in a band. That's amazing with the different things. But Mr. Fishman, please.
Yeah, like you're cut out there, Dimitri. That's funny. Yeah, the other thing is that like if you build a chicken coop, you have like a clear success, failure. Like you have a clear goal of what you're trying to do, you know what I mean? And if it doesn't work, it's very clear. Whereas if you're writing a book, it's like, what are you writing it for? You know what I mean? And what do you want as a final result? And this is something that artists get caught up in all the time, right? They're like, I want to make it. You know, it's like, well, what does that mean exactly? You know what I mean? Like, how many records are you trying to sell? And it's never enough, right? Whereas with a chicken coop, it's like eventually it's enough, right? If it works, it keeps the chickens inside, keeps the coyotes out, then it's enough. You know what I mean? So there's like that clear differentiating principle between success and failure. So I think that's another dimension to this whole
one
thing.
Thing that's interesting bringing up Zizek is that his idea of drive is actually just this like circling around the failure. So like there's a feedback loop, but there's not a goal. Actually, like the goal is the missing of the goal, actually. And I wonder if intellectual life is a little like writing is a little bit more like that. It's like enjoying the continual failure to hit your goal, because the goal is either so ambiguous or it's like an intentional void that you kind of just enjoy this circling around the failure instead of hitting this aim, you know, which feels like, you know, because if you were to hit that utilitarian thing, like, hey, I got to write this piece of content and my goal is to like hit this number of like open rate and clicks per user, and, you know, like there's something that feels different, like if you actually succeeded at that versus you put something out that was much more experimental and maybe you enjoyed the act of creating it more.
That's a really interesting insight. I was just reading and finished recently, I enjoyed it, Mr. Hunter Coates' book on conspiracy in Lacan, trying to bring a Lacanian analysis to the phenomenon of conspiracies and why they're forming today. He does a YouTube channel called Dissatisfied Philosophy. Really nice guy. And one of the ideas that he was talking about is there's a way in which conspiracy is almost desire's masterpiece, precisely because the big other of the conspiracy is deception itself, like capital D deception almost. And so like you don't obtain the goal that you're after, but that's precisely proof that there is a conspiracy. And so when you don't get the object, it never becomes evidence that the object is not there. Whereas in other circumstances, like if you're a writer and you never write the perfect book, you might interpret that as evidence that that it doesn't exist, that what you're after is not there, and then you have to like, you know, negate, sublate that to a more mature place. What you're talking about, when you come to kind of see that as the situation, that certain lack, and appreciate it, you more internalize it. Whereas in the conspiracy, you never reach the end, but it's never part of you. It's always in the government, so the lack is always externalized and projected. So it's almost like the worst of all possible perversions, because rather than the lack be like essentialized in yourself and you learn to integrate with it, it's always being kept from you by the government, But then the fact that it's always kept from you by the government means it's like desire's masterpiece, because desire never reached the object that would unveil the desire as not having an object. And then all you got to do is learn to enjoy being denied your object, right? And that would be the enjoyment then, right? The blockage of the desire keeps it alive. And so it's really interesting to think of, is there something similar to that Lacanian structure of the conspiracy with writing a book, right? Where but I guess that it's interesting because I'm increasingly convinced like some of the most important topics are these real fine nuances, right? Like there's these really slight differences that make all the difference in the world. Whereas when you write a book, you have to get to the place where you just simply understand that once you finally finish the book, it's not going to be this giant firework goes off and you're super happy and yay, I did it or whatever. Like there's always a certain level of, okay, now it's on Amazon, great. What are we eating tonight? Oh, I guess I got to cut the yard. You go back to the daily life. But when you come to expect that, then when it occurs, you're not overwhelmed, or you're not like sad, I guess, or depressed. And instead you go on to the next thing. Or you say, oh, no, this very practice taught me certain ways of carrying myself in the world or thinking about the world that I otherwise wouldn't have learned. So there's a value in that. And yet on the same way, like that's similar. You always have something to do in the act of writing. But in the conspiracy, you always have something to do, but you never actually internalize with the lack. You're always actually believing you can get to the bottom of the conspiracy. And the fact you never do, though, actually just confirms that the conspiracy is there, and thus you should keep trying. So it's kind of interesting. I'm kind of thinking of those comparisons where you can't fall into a conspiracy with a chicken coop, right? Like you can't get a chicken coop conspiracy unless maybe you do something out of a Thomas Pynchon novel talking about the phone company with Byron the Bulb or something in Gravity's Rainbow, which would be impressive. That's that's really impressive. So you have that check and balance with the chicken coop, and then I'll give it to Matthew. But the danger is you finish the chicken coop, and now what? Now you're bored. Okay, we did it. You don't have anything to keep going. But chicken coop building is not going to be a conspiracy, where stuff like writing a novel is closer to going into the kind of conspiracy thing. And it's interesting to think of those on a gradient, but let me give it to Matthew.
For what it's worth, I love the idea of like a story of somebody who sets out to make a chicken coop, and like there's this continual like series of events where like it just keeps getting compounded to where you can never finish it, and then like the final end, there's like a destruction of the chicken coop that somehow the seeds of that final destruction were laid in the very beginning. Like that would be a fun story. But I wanted to throw out like what we were talking about writing a book made me think of something Richard Hananiah put out yesterday called The Case Against Most Books. And he actually basically argues you shouldn't read most books. He even quotes Sam Bankman-Fried, who at one point said, I don't want to say no book is ever worth reading, but I actually do believe something pretty close to that. If you wrote a book, you fucked up, and it should have been a 6-paragraph blog post. And Hananiah says that there's actually only 3 types of books that are worth reading: history books, books of historical interest like the Bible, and genius, which takes you on a journey. And I think it's really interesting. I think that this attitude is actually becoming more and more popular, and I've like struggled with it myself of like there's a huge opportunity cost to reading a book. It takes up a bunch of time, and there's all these other books out there you could be reading, whereas you could listen to in the same amount of time it takes you to read a book, you can listen to 10 podcasts, read a bunch of Wikipedia articles, read a bunch of Substack posts, and like have a conversation with somebody, and maybe you would learn more. And there's like this constant experience of FOMO and like an extreme opportunity cost to reading books. And so I'm curious by that take, because I think we're probably all like kind of like book people here, secretly like kind of fetishize books a little bit and feel like we should read more. I think that's a really complicated, interesting experience.
No, that's a wonderful reflection, Mr. Javier Rivera. Good to see you. We're talking about conspiracies, chicken coops, and writing a book. And actually, the question would be, is dating more like writing a book or more like a conspiracy? I'm curious now, through a Lacanian analysis. Do you in fact date in such a manner to where you're hoping never to find the one, because if you find the one, you can't find enjoyment in the denial of the object? Or is it somewhere like writing where you're never going to find the one, you're never going to write the great book, and yet you still you still do it despite that? You still you accept the failure, like your recent piece on the phenomenology of dating. So are you dating as part of a conspiracy, or are you dating as an encounter with failures that you can learn to integrate with? I think that's wonderful to think. What do you think, Javier? Situationships. You love situationships, right?
Oh my God, the situationship doesn't exist. I take the Lacanian notion of this. But I do agree with your latter proposition about, you do it for the sake of it, even though it's gonna fail, and so on and so on. Yeah, I like that idea. Definitely. This kind of love is violence. I'm gonna get that my tattoo.
Yeah, you're gonna get that tattooed, right? I like it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna, most people in Virginia, when they're drinking out of a mason jar, it's moonshine. So I hope you're having a good time in Arizona right now. You probably are, right? I think also the question that Mr. Stanley just raised is very, very interesting, because there is that FOMO feeling constantly. You could always be watching another YouTube video, learning more, having another conversation. And isn't it funny? This is one of the great paradoxes of time-saving technologies, like the cell phone or the computer is supposed to save labor. In the act of saving you labor, it also opens up possibility that then actually makes you use all of your free time because you don't want to miss out on another idea or another thinker or something. So there's some kind of irony in time-saving stuff. In the same way that for Mr. Javier's work, opening up dating possibilities has made everyone extremely confused about dating. Like you can date, you have all these apps, you can meet all these people and all these possibilities, and it should be easier to date than ever before, right? Because you have all these connectabilities. Yeah, in the very act of gaining all those dating possibilities, everything is chaotic now, which then speaks to belonging again, givens and releases, which maybe should just be 3 paragraphs because it doesn't fall into one of those categories, and I'm just going to cancel the release now. So that's, we won't have another book to pressure people to read and different things. I definitely think the argument has to be made that there is some sort of value that reading adds to the subject or the ability to think. Maybe it gives you focus or the creative that, say, not reading doesn't. Like, that would be the question, right? So theoretically, does one gain something in reading Less Than Nothing by Zizek that they do not gain by listening to Less Than Nothing by Zizek? And I think it's important to ask that question regarding the same book, right? Because if you ask different books, you can always, have that debate. But if it's the same book, is there something about the act of reading that adds a value different from the act of listening? You can even take it up another notch and say, is there something in reading Less Than Nothing as a whole that is better than, say, reading summaries or listening to Zizek lecture on it, so on and so forth? Because it tends to be the case that when someone lectures on their book, they bring out the nuggets. Maybe they leave out the digressions, but they kind of focus on the main ideas. So what's the value add, right, of reading all of Zizek or just listening to him? And I actually ask this question a lot, like, as someone who does literature, a big question is, why read Faulkner? Freaking Sound of Fury sucks. Absalom is a nightmare. Why read it? What do you gain out of reading Ulysses by Joyce or Finnegan's Wake that is so special, other than being able to tell people at parties you read Finnegan's Wake and feeling superior to them? So isn't it bad for the ego? Maybe it's like, maybe we only read for ego, right? And actually then giving up reading would be good for us. Similar questions could be asked, is something gained in dating face-to-face without the dating apps that's better than using the apps? Because ultimately, to me, the question is, listening to a book theoretically would take less time than reading it, especially if you do a double speed, right? Likewise, like using a dating app to find someone to date is easier than going to Barnes and Noble and hoping the barista is free or something like that, right? Going on a seeking, right? What is lost in the time-saving technology? What is lost, or is anything lost, or is it purely a matter of increasing possibility? That's a good question. And then maybe I wonder, and then I'll give it to Mr. Stanley, does the time-saving technology make you precisely more likely to be unable to tell the difference between falling into a conspiracy or falling into a process to help you encounter failure that you can then integrate with and respond to? So maybe it ties to the earlier question as well. Mr. Stanley.
I would just add really briefly that in the whole discussion, like, we can never assume that reading is inherently superior to listening, because reading is actually the newer of the two and quite infantile in human history. So like the reality, one, not only writing things down, but also mass literacy are both incredibly new technologies on the human time scale. And so, like, historically, most people have listened to things. They've listened to bards, they've listened to myths, they've watched dances and rituals. And so I think it's really important to remember that, like, we're the innovators, we're the weird ones. And I think there's like this inherent assumption of the sacredness of reading that I think it is definitely something we bring. It's totally a bias of ours.
What if, and I'll give it to Javier, what if it really is like a Lacan analysis of the phenomenology of reading? Because when you read the word cat, you're being denied the object of cat. and you come to enjoy that denial of the object that reading constantly recapitulates to you. And so there's some sort of screwing around with desire that goes on in the act of reading that makes us overstate how good reading is, overstate oral traditions, and it's all just part of a conspiracy on ourselves to make us feel better about the situation. Some sort of self-sabotage in the act of reading. But Javier, please tell us about dating and your dating life. How's your love life?
I don't know. I guess it's good. I don't know. But okay. So I agree with Matthew here. As long as, but you see that here's, I just want to make this division clear, because like I don't disagree with the fact that like reading is the kind of invention here on this idea, but I feel like my distaste for this area is that culture actually is obsessed with efficiency. So immediately I am like, no, like I have a distaste for efficiency and grind culture. But I don't disagree with the idea of listening to podcasts and so on. I don't disagree with this. But for me, it's like, one, I think reading gives you this illusion of control, right? I turn the page, I feel like I can seep into the text more. Yet, ironically, you probably absorb the same amount of information as listening to it. That's just like my phenomenological experience of it. Like, I genuinely feel like when I'm listening to something, the hardest thing for me to experience is for me to let go, for me to not press repeat, so I can get what's saying. I think Dawood actually gave a really good metaphor recently. He said, listening to an audiobook is like watching the bus leave with a group of people. Meanwhile, I think the reading metaphor was like, you're like talking to every single person on that bus, so to speak, because you're turning every single page. So, yeah, I feel like we need to bring up this notion of efficiency, knowledge, and truth, because if it's just for the accumulation of knowledge, then sure, these time-saving methods are efficient. But if we're talking about truth, to me, that's different. That's different. But yeah.
Lovely, and I'll give it to Cheetan. And I agree, build that freaking chicken coop. We don't need to go to Food Lion and get eggs. There's something in the practice of building a chicken coop. And also, I just realized it's Food Lion, as if the lion is made of food, or are you the food the lion eats? There's a grocery store in America called Food Lion, and now I'm getting really freaked out about that. But Cheetan, good to see you, my friend. I hope you are well, Cheetan.
Yes. Hi. I'm not a good person to add to this discussion in many ways, but I remember Derrida writing a text where he sort of argued that in some ways writing comes before speaking, if you remember. Am I right? And there was this kind of, and one can see that when minute we sort of, and I don't remember the exact argument he made. I taught it a long time back, at my university. But the structure of this problem, thinking that simply thinking that speaking comes before writing or listening comes before reading, might not be that accurate. There are various ways in which our thinking itself sort of acts like a text to us, and how do we think through that problem? Of course, the technology of reading might have come later, but something like reading was always at stake the minute we started thinking. Something of that nature has to be, I think, thought through in this kind of discussion. My own problem as such is a very different one with reading in that sense, because when I was an engineering student long time back, and I used to read books, so I could go to a bookstore, find a book that I've never heard before. I never heard the author's name. I look at the cover, it seems interesting, and I'll go home and read it for months, 3 months, 4 months. I'll put into that book, and I've found one of the best books of my life, or best experiences reading in my life doing that. Today, when I actually read for a living in that sense, when you teach and I'm reading more than a book a month or maybe 2 or 3 books also sometimes, I can't do that anymore. I can't go to a bookstore, pick a random book. I such so much reading lined up on my desk that isn't possible for me. So for at some point, reading itself has become like an audiobook in that sense. So even though I am reading books, so for example, would not find reading Zizek that difficult. But I have a copy of Arabian Nights by Richard F. Burton's translation kept on my desk for past 2 years, or a novel by a Hindi novel which I want to read and I've read like 60-80 pages kept on my desk for like 1.5 years, which I want to finish. I read 10 pages a week and I let it and keep it back and I come back to it after 3 weeks and something of that nature happens to many books around me. Even William Blake's poetry. I love reading it. I read it a long time back. It's there. I can't. How do we think through that? Even when we are pointing, even when we are saying that we are reading, at what point reading itself becomes something not like reading to you? It's not like that binary between reading and listening is always intact. So even when you become an academic and you read too much, then reading itself becomes an act like you're hurrying through it, you're doing certain things through it. You're not doing that activity with that time and space that you did it when you were actually reading as doing something other than doing other things in your life, in your world, in that sense. I'm not sure how you think about it. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. And now I'm thinking about, so I've been doing this paper and pulling out citations from Less Than Nothing. And it's like, I don't hesitate to read like books like Tearing with the Negative or Less Than Nothing. But then I really should read The Leopard, which is apparently one of the greatest novels ever written. I mean, that I've never read. And I keep like putting it off. And it's interesting to think that, like, why is it easier almost to put off fiction sometimes, especially like that deep fiction? I'm not sure. That's kind of interesting to me as you bring that up, because I am actually thinking about that. Like, I haven't read, I have a few more collections of poetry by Wallace Stevens. I adore Wallace Stevens, and I haven't read them yet because I keep putting them off for a nonfiction text. That's interesting. And then I'll give it to Hyrule. I think, isn't it like William Ong who talks about how there's speech before the scientific treatise, and then there's a printing press, which he required for the scientific treatise. But then once the scientific treatise is invented, the nature of speech is forever different. Like the way people talk is different after the book. And it's almost like milk and dye are mixed. So there is a question, is there some way that speaking has forever been corrupted by reading in the book? That we can never like escape now and what have we lost? What have we gained? That's interesting. William Ong is very good on that. And now I'm wondering if a way we're going to rebel against the AI is reading silently, because all the AI can do is read aloud, and we're going to like stick it to the man by reading silently. So maybe reading will be an act of rebellion. So we're going to stick it to it. Mr. Fishman, please.
Yeah, so I think like I would differentiate between fiction and nonfiction here, right? Because like I think that in fiction, like kind of what Javier was saying about how listening to an audiobook is like watching the bus go by, as opposed to reading the book is like being on the bus and talking to the passengers. I think you could say the same thing about like a movie. When they make a movie out of a book, right? It's like the movie never lives up to the book, even though there's more in it, right? And I think that what's going on is that like the book chooses one thing at a time, right? Like the cat entered the room. Whereas if you film a cat entering a room, there's 101 other things happening in that scene, and it's like it doesn't bring you to the relevant thing one at a time. You know what I mean? And there's also like listening to an audiobook as opposed to reading, is that when you listen to the audiobook, it's in someone else's voice, and it's in like, it's their inflections and their emphases on this word or that within the sentence. Whereas when you're reading it, you have to read it in your own voice, and like there's that kind of engagement, right? But then when it comes to nonfiction, like philosophy, like I don't read I don't read that much, period. But I always get pissed off at philosophy books, because what'll happen is the author will set out his premise, right? He'll say, if we accept that X is true, then we can say for the next 600 pages, Y and Z, right? And it's like, okay, but X is not true. Like, are you going to address the fact that X is not true? 200 pages, 300, no. Okay, well, then like your whole book falls apart, right? Whereas I feel like what's so great about about dialogue, and that's really like the way that I like to explore ideas is in dialogue or by watching people talk, even way above and beyond like a lecture. I like to see two people talk about it, right? Because then there's that constant feedback. It's like, wait, hold on. Like, you can't just say that and move on, right? You're going to, like, the other person is going to stop them and give them feedback and make sure that what they're saying makes sense every step of the way, right? A philosophical book is like this solipsistic thing where the author gets to create his own language and set out his own premises, and then he'll make his argument. And you just have to go along with it, even if you don't agree, you know what I mean? And so I think dialogue is really the best way for philosophy. I guess the advantage of writing a philosophical book is that you can put it all there. You know what I mean? And dialogue, it often becomes scattered and fractioned, and you go off on tangents, and then it's like, oh, I wanted to get back to the thing. Whereas in a book, you can lay it all out sequentially and really think it through. And I think that kind of touches on what Chitan was saying about how like writing comes before speaking. Is that like if I have an idea that I'm trying to bring forward, I have to sort of prepare it in my mind first, right? It's like I have to set out the whole symbolism of the thing and like get my thoughts in order. And that's kind of like writing, whether or not I physically write it down, there's that sort of organization of the idea. And then I bring it forward to the conversation in which it becomes challenged. And that's where the life of the idea really comes forth, I think. But you do have to do that first move of just like setting it out in your own mind. And so I think that's kind of how I think about it.
It's really interesting what you're saying there, because now I'm thinking about like, yeah, so you don't like it when the writer assumes that we come from a state of nature where everything was peaceful and come up with a theory of how the government should be done based on something that's never been observed. What I don't understand, Mr. Hybrid, that seems like a recipe for paradise. That's interesting. But it's very interesting too what you're getting at, because now I'm thinking about one, obviously Plato's Dialogue, and there's something about the fact that Plato's dialogues are fictional that make like they're fictional. I mean, I'm not saying they didn't happen at all. Obviously, that's the great debate, but there's like it's almost like they're more honest as a fictional display, and then they're talking about ideas. It's kind of interesting how when it's in the form of a nonfiction text that kind of presents itself as unquestionable, it's like, well, this is everything follows, it's unquestionable. There's almost something that feels more dishonest about it. I'm not sure about that. That's really interesting. And now I'm also thinking about this weird tension of like reading a whole book. Not, at the beginning, we were saying about this constant feedback where the Chicken Coop is constantly giving feedback, but when you write a book, it's like an elongated feedback, as Mr. Stanley was putting it, which I really like. It's kind of like when you read a book, the risk is like you get to the end and you're like, that was garbage. Would have been nice to have some feedback along the way to know it was a garbage, or that's good. But then to really get a thought completely, you kind of need that space, right? So there's this interesting dilemma, like to really get a complete thought, you need this risk of not getting enough feedback along the way to save you from wasting time. And then it turns out it was just, because there's kind of a way where if you don't buy the axioms of a philosopher like Rousseau, it's kind of a conspiracy. I don't want to push that too far, but it's at least like an internally consistent system of, oh, this is the truth of reality you didn't know about until Rousseau wrote his book or Hobbes wrote his book, right? And I'm not saying it's equivalent to QAnon, but there's something like an internally consistent structure going on, and you're following it through, and then you become like a Hoffer true believer or something, and then it's QAnon something, right? So it's like, oh, well, we don't want that. It'd be better to have dialogue. But then, of course, the danger of dialogue is you get regular feedback, but then you don't go anywhere because you're just going back and forth and you're not actually developing anything. So it would require a particular kind of people in the dialogue to be able to have the feedback still be like moving forward, not just, I don't know, like a vertical additional to a horizontal. This is really interesting because there's a trade-off here, it seems, between long feedback, wasting your time, but then also completing a thought, which then makes me, of course, think of Gödel with the trade-off between coherence and correspondence that Chitan and I have talked about. You want to get the whole coherent model, but the longer you're concentrating on the coherence, the less feedback you get to determine if it has something that corresponds with reality. So there's an interesting tension there, but let me give it to Chitan. Chitan.
I just sort of, I know personally, I've had a phase in my life when I was doing a lot of literature work, in taking classes in literature department and stuff. And I remember going through the same phase with reading novels also, where reading novels became sort of my second nature and became such a comfortable space that I didn't, it didn't challenge me in any, it was almost like work you had to, you had to do, and at that time philosophy seemed like this very difficult task to me, and so on and so forth. And then of course you enter into philosophy department, you take the courses there, earlier texts you read, Nietzsche and so on and so forth. And today I think there is something about there's something about you being able to do something comfortably in that sense, which itself sort of limits your ability to gain something from it. A lot of times when I enter into say, classrooms and I have a young student in front of me who's reading a text which I had read in my young age, or who's reading something which with a lot of enthusiasm, I feel very jealous. There is strong jealousy that I experience in my body, because I don't experience what that that young student is experiencing, because for me it is such a second nature that I would probably have to do something else to get that experience back. It might not come from, and if I would do that, for instance, it's not like I can't find the time to read a novel. I can. The problem is that if I'm reading a novel, that is not a break from reading philosophy. They both are reading exercises at the end of it, isn't it? If I'm reading a novel, I would probably want to go and play something, or I might want to go for a walk, or I might to take a break from, work is very interesting. That work needs to be interspersed with play in that sense, and how do you incorporate these different forms of work within your, it's almost very interesting. Challenge that sort of comes to us, and so I point quick, I'm not sure that the problem is actually one form of language game, as Wittgenstein would call it, or any form of one activity. The problem is that we are always capable of doing any activity to a point that we can gain some perverse enjoyment from it. You can always do a certain activity compulsively. And at some point you have to start thinking about at what point does your compulsive self activates within that, within that zone. I'm not sure.
Let me give it to Javier. Yeah, we need Ebert on the excess saturation, right? You were speaking, it makes me think of when I was a kid, like sneaking downstairs with the Redwall novels that were amazing with the mice at the Abbey, and putting blankets in the bathtub and like reading till 3 a.m. I haven't done that in a long time because the books don't have that same effect. And what if we're all reading just because we have a subconscious desire to return to Eden? Like, is it like some subconscious desire to return to that feeling? Likewise, I remember like the first time I read a philosophy book that blew my mind. Like, I haven't had that in a long time. So is it like, well, I'm not saying I haven't read a good philosophy book. I'm saying that it's that's interesting. It is a different experience, isn't it? Like that magic. You're looking for that magic. And I have to admit, sometimes I had that magic regarding a bad philosophy book that then later on I realized was bad. So it's not necessarily saying the magic equals truth, but that experience itself, which then actually couldn't that just lead you down a bad path because you're looking for the magic and you're like, oh, this is cool, and you're reading garbage philosophy, right? So then it's like, oh, there's a truth conspiracy and you're going down. But yeah, that's interesting. Let me give it to Javier. And I'm now wondering what dating's like after the book and before the book. Like if you had to talk to someone, you had to literally talk to them, as opposed to now you can read text messages. Does that impact dating as well? But that's interesting, Chitan, with the magic. Javier.
So Chitan raised something that, like for me, because I started school, the biggest thing that I had to do that irked me a lot was I started shifting towards audiobooks because I'm so comfortable with reading. But then I realized like it's impossible for me to maintain this like rigor. So I started doing audiobooks. And for me, like audiobooks is more about like letting go. Like it's like the sort of perverse enjoyment I get from like having my book and like literally examining every single paragraph to make sure I understand it. Like it's a really perverse kind of thing that's like happening when you're like enjoying this book. And it's sort of like a little costume that you do, right? You set the scene for yourself, you find your chair, you find your book, you get your pencils, you're like, yes, I'm going to do this, I'm going to be philosopher man. And you open your book and you set it that way. But audiobooks irk me because I'm just like, it really shows my repetition. Like I'm like, no, repeat. No, repeat. No, no, repeat again. No, I didn't get that. Repeat. For me, it's like the most obvious form of repetition for me. Where I'm trying to, I can really see the perverse enjoyment that is most apparent for me in audiobooks. But for me, this form of audio is more about surrendering, in my opinion. I'm not like debating, is this a form of reading? Is this a way to acquire knowledge? For me, it's about letting go. And that's very difficult. I found that very difficult. Like, just literally take like a Hegel, like download Hegel, audiobook or something, because I know it exists. Just listen to it. Like, don't even try to like grasp nothing. You will see how you'll start itching like Zizek about like you want to understand what is being said. Like, and for me, this is like a more, I don't know what this challenge is doing per se. I think this is what I'm trying to bring up. I don't know what this is doing. I don't know if this is sublimation. I don't know if this is like whatever, but I think Chitan is like hitting something here about like, reading was so like second nature. Like an audiobook makes me extremely uncomfortable. Like extremely, extremely uncomfortable. So yeah, I'd like to, I guess, explore that uncomfortability. What is it so uncomfortable about choosing the other option per se? And I think Chitan's right about there's something perverse or something pathological about it that we enjoy.
In my case, just to sort of add just experience in that sense, I remember I used to always read from books in my childhood. And I remember buying my first iPad from my salary because buying books became very expensive. So you thought you just buy one device and you read from. And I have not read a book in that sense. I read a lot on my iPad, but I haven't read a book from the copy. I think maybe more than a couple of years, 3 years. I haven't read a book from the hard copy. And when I read from a book, it is slightly, it feels different in that sense. Not a good thing. I enjoy reading it from a book than the iPad. I would preferably go back to that, earlier way of doing things.
Yes, and Matthew, I agree. Also, your comment on Derrida seeing the book as the playground of the sign was very good. And yeah, for some reason, books cost a whole lot of money. I haven't figured out why. It's really silly. It's crazy, right? It's almost like they have to print it and different things where digital files are cheaper. Weird. It's very interesting because what you're describing, Javier, I completely agree with. There's a time where you're picking out a book and you're underlining every sentence and you're thinking it through and different things like that. And there's this weird thing where when you're immature in reading, you don't pay attention. You just let the lines go before your eyes. Then there's a stage of getting like really trying to focus on it. And then, yes, belonging again will hopefully be on Libergen in 100 years. That's what we're working on. We will see. Tomorrow, I don't know, but in 100 years, maybe. But then you get to this place where you're really trying to pay attention, but that leads you to this kind of nervous, like capture everything. And then you have to work out of that to a place where you let it go without simultaneously giving up your attention, though. There's some weird move where you have to like commit to being there to let it go. Like this is the thing. There's like this third commit to letting go. That is, I'm going to put myself in the place. It's not when you stop reading, let it go. No, I'm going to read. No, I'm going to listen, but I'm going to let it wash over me. That's really curious. And actually, I think the same happens in conversation. Like if you're in a conversation with someone that has to capture every word or make sure every fact is that you see this in small talk or like the conversation dies, right? It like doesn't work. You have to like let things flow, even if you don't hear everything or catch everything, or I mispronounce words all the time. I mean, like you gotta like if every time I tried to say the Lacan J word, you guys were like, you're a freaking idiot, it's Giazon. So it's like, oh, it's so stupid. Like the conversation would die because I'd curl up in a ball and cry. So there has to be this letting go and yet the being at the place to let go. This third stage seems to actually suggest some sort of, that's how you spell it, some sort of stage of the development of the subject that seems really necessary in an information overload society, not just in the act of reading, but in general, right? Because there's this weird thing in dating too, right? Javier, you're doing on the phenomenology of dating. Like I'm trying to think of what would audio relationships look like versus audiobooks, right? Where you're just like, listen, like what is the difference of the experience? Where there's something dehumanizing about that, right? But then there's also something about the regular connection of the person, that you are there to regularly connect to them, but you're not hinging on every text message. You're not hinging on hearing from them every 5 minutes. You're always connected, but then you're able to let it go in that state of always connected. Likewise, you're reading, but you're letting it wash over you. And is it a problem that we have in dating is we don't have that third stage where we can be always connected with people we're interested in or we're dating, but we're not at the place where we can let it wash over us without it constantly reflecting, oh my gosh, Shara hasn't called me in 5 minutes, he hates me. Oh my gosh, maybe we're doing all these mind games all the time in dating. Is that a sign of a failure to let things go over us? Because we're kind of almost in a sense forced to always be reading the book because we always have the cell phone or we always have the internet, right? So this interesting state of the subject that one has to mature to in reading might have parallels with society in general. I'm not sure, but I'm glad you're doing phenomenology of dating. But Dimitri, it is good to see you, my friend. I hope you are doing well.
Yes, very good. Yes, this is a very interesting topic. Like for me, I'm still reading The Science of Logic by Hegel, and this is one of the books that I have to be in a certain state of mind, and sometimes I tell myself, okay, today I'm gonna read 50 pages, but after 20 I'm like, I can't take it anymore. And it's literally like this, like it doesn't even matter, like I can pick up, like I can read Zizek or whatever afterwards, and then it's like, oh god, what a relief, now it's like actually readable and it's not so difficult. But yeah, like with Science of Logic, I do want to like capture it all, and I always make sure that when I'm reading that book that I make notes of it, that I rewrite sentences, that I do with a pencil, whereas with other books, it's not always so necessary. But anyway, I was reading Less Than Nothing, and you're talking about something very interesting. That's like, you gotta put in the most effort to let go. So I'll just read this passage. Please bear with me. It's gonna be a bit long, but it's very good. So I'm not gonna hold back. So this is Zizek, Less Than Nothing. It takes the most strenuous effort for the subject to erase itself in its particular content as an agent intervening in the object, and to expose itself as a neutral medium, as the site of the system's self-deployment. Hegel thereby overcomes the standard dualism between system and freedom, between the Spinozist notion of a substantial deus sive natura, of which I am a part, caught in its determinism, and the Fichtean notion of the subject as an agent opposed to inert stuff, trying to dominate and appropriate it. The supreme moment of the subject's freedom is when it sets free its object, leaving it alone to freely deploy itself. Hegel quote, "The idea's absolute freedom consists in its resolution to freely let go out of itself the moment of its particularity." Absolute freedom, this is Zizek again, absolute freedom is here literally absolute in the etymological meaning of absolvere, releasing, letting go. Schelling was the first to criticize this move as illegitimate. After completing the circle of the logical self-development of the notion in The Science of Logic, and being aware that it had taken place in the abstract medium of thought, Hegel had somehow to make the passage to real life. However, there were no categories in his logical capable of accomplishing this passage, which is why he had to resort to terms like decision. The idea decides to release nature from itself, which are not categories of logic, but of the will and practical life. This is Schelling's critique. What this critique clearly misses is the way the act of releasing the other is thoroughly immanent to the dialectical process as its conclusive moment, the sign of the completion of the dialectical circle. So this is the passage I've been thinking about for the last 2 days, and it's really crazy. Also, the etymological meaning of absolute and absolvere is very interesting here. So
first off, and I'll pass it to Javier, you have like the best reading voice. Like, you need to be on LibriVox, like doing the recordings. You can pronounce all of the terms. You have this wonderful cadence. The rhyme is really, really good. I like when you do the readings in the on the course and the Science of Logic, like the courses where you're reading the paragraphs, the open sessions. I'm like, oh my gosh, so well done, sir. I think that is a brilliant passage to bring into this conversation. And I think, look, basically what we're getting in the same way that as Javier in his video talks about, where in Hegel's like, all right, look on, right? Look on for the thought, like phenomenologically observe what I'm talking about if you don't want to read this book and then come back to it. It's very interesting that what we seem to be suggesting is that literally the phenomenology of reading suggests that passage in less than nothing. And then there's something about dating that suggests that passage in less than nothing. And that also almost goes to show you why trying to live a full, like, dare I say, trying to live a life is almost necessary to get philosophy, because otherwise you can read a paragraph and like that, say, okay, I see what he's saying, but it's in the logical. But then when you live it and you connect it, it's like, then there's the magic moment. You're a kid again reading Red Wall in the bathroom. You get the magic, but the magic, all the kind of click, but it's also part of a sense of the truth of it. And we will start the crowdfunding for Dimitri's audiobook. It sounds good. Javier, and I'll give it back to Dimitri. Mr. Javier.
So I'm going to tie in dating here because, because I can see that you've been prodding me. But so just to give some like tangible, I guess, maybe parallels here. I'm going to speak of the notion of attraction and then the notion of, let's say, truth for reading, since we're all philosophy minded. What I've noticed recently, and this actually has to do with my own experience with talking with like an older woman that I did not initially find attractive at all. And Dimitri knows this story. What I've noticed is that I was holding on to specific ideas and conceptions. And this actually roots back from like my own relations with my father, right? So just to give like a little bit more like intimate context is that I felt like I needed to have kids in order to say and prove my father wrong that I can be a good father, right? Now, this is, of course, the imaginary relation because my father does not care about this idea, okay? But the reason why this got brought up, this notion of reflection got brought up with kids, is because the woman that I'm talking to, she's already had kids. She doesn't want any more kids, okay? And she's got like 10 years on me. So Dave was like, nice. Okay, but this is the point of critical reflection. Once I realized that this notion of having kids was predicated on that relation of my father, and I was able to let it go, that I was able to embrace this contradiction of like, wait a second, what if I don't have kids and I'm still not like my dad? What if I do that? And then all of a sudden, it was like it took a span within a couple of days. I found her like the most attractive woman ever. Like the attraction immediately immersed. It was crazy. I have another story about, there was a girl I used to date. Like at first I was hooked on this other girl. And when I was on a date with my ex at the time, I couldn't get over the fact of her nose. And then I caught the signifier. The signifier was, oh, she's not like so-and-so. And then I said, how about you just let this go? And then all of a sudden, when I let that go, again, I found I was completely immersed. I was enamored by her, right? So I think there is something to that experience of letting go that immerses us into that truth and so on. But it really does take some real effort in this idea of letting go. But if you are super intentful like me, you have to do this other move, letting go of the fact that you can't let go, and then it immerses. So that's the other thing, if you're like me. But yeah, that's my sense on that.
I've got to bounce, everybody. It was great talking.
Thank you,
Have a
Matt,
great
and Mr. Stanley. Good to see you, sir. And we're going to listen more about Javier's love life because it's grand. I want to hear all the juicy details. But no, actually, the point, and I'll give it to Dimitri, there does actually seem to be a problem with thinking of yourself as someone who lets things go, and you identify with letting go, and you actually have to let go of that as well. And that's the real subtle move that you can miss. Likewise, you have to let go of being humble. When people are like, oh, I'm a really humble person. Well, then you're not. Like the moment you're talking that way, you're not. So there's that weird meta move there that's so easy to miss that I think everyone has to make. That's very easy to miss. But thank you for sharing us with your love life. You know, I really appreciate that, Javier. Dimitri.
So what you said, you have to let go of the letting go. I really like that, because it's never enough to just let go. You know, it's never enough. So about, to go back to this this idea of the subject's freedom, it's, when I read this passage for the first time, it seems to denote a kind of flow state, you know. And of course, there you can have like a flow state in dancing or singing or like jamming, you know, or like a freestyle rap cipher, things like this. But also in philosophy itself, and there is probably different forms to this, right? Like it's like when you're reading something and you're really into it, and you read like one book in a day because it's just so good. Or when you're writing and you don't even have to put so much effort in because it's just coming out. Or in speech, you know, in or talking with another person. And Zachary, to go back to what you were saying at the beginning of this conversation, I do think there is loads of value to seeing philosophy primarily as having to be embedded in dialogue instead of books. And you know, a while ago I sent this this friend of mine something I wrote because he wanted to read it, and then he read it, and then he said, yeah, it was very nice, I could understand it very easily. And then I asked him what did he think of it, and then it turned out that he completely misunderstood it. So we have to be so careful with like telling ourselves like, oh yeah, I read this very difficult thinker and I plowed through it, therefore I understand it. No, you probably don't. And this doubt, like to have this doubt, is really valuable, I think, because then you're actually like, that kind of is kind of the anxiety that pushes you to, okay, do you actually understand it? Go back, you know, go back to it, check different sources, check what I do often is that I will go back to, when I'm reading Hegel or something like this, go back to the German to see if it really matches up to the English and things like this. And yeah, something that I really blew my mind one time when I was reading his history of the history of philosophy by Hegel. And then Hegel gets at a very interesting topic, which is where does philosophy start? What is the beginning of philosophy? So he talks about Parmenides, and that actually Parmenides, by like bracketing of opinions and stating that like pure being, soul being is the true, is where philosophy proper starts. But then 2 sentences later, he says, actually, Parmenides is not the proper start of philosophy. We have to find this elsewhere. Now, when I was reading that in English, it actually said something totally different, and it actually said the opposite of what was there in the German. So now it's the question, you know, like, is like what did Hegel actually mean? I think Hegel meant what he actually said, but in reading, you know, like you can like, you have a certain attention span, and eventually it stops, and you have to tell yourself to stop reading, because you're not gonna get so much more out of it. But yeah, like philosophy, the way I see it is that it is a way of life. Or I like what Layman Pascal recently said, is that philosophy is a means to turn the soul into an instrument. So whereas with music and other forms of art, you kind of bracket off a part of your soul into certain, like, release it into certain phenomenological experience, whether you're the creator or like the perceiver of art. Whereas with philosophy, you're doing that with your entire soul. And like, this is why I think it's so important to just Give me a sec. I have some notes about this because I'm currently very interested in this topic. So Hegel's philosophy is not dialectical philosophy; it's speculative. Dialectics, they end up in negativity. So for Hegel, there's no such thing as just always ending up in negativity, or like in abstract nothingness. There's always an affirmation that comes afterwards, or is entailed by it, or is even equated with that very negativity. Now, Hegel will, Zizek calls Hegel the most sublime hysteric, just like Lacan does. He paraphrases Lacan. However, you can read Hegel and be like, oh my God, this is such a totalitarian metaphysical thinker. He just says he has the absolute truth, which kind of is the opposite of, like more mythical, feminine way of going about life. This very much this logical rigor that says this is the absolute truth because of these categories. Now, I think the paradox about Hegel, to me at least, in my reading, is that what Hegel does is really allow you to make definitive statements that are as well provisional, but the fact that they are like definitive doesn't the fact that these definitive statements are provisional doesn't take away any of the fact that they are like definitive. Just like the fact that something is external and internal at the same time doesn't take away any of its externality. I hope this makes sense. Because then I think this is a huge mistake that you can do by reading that's kind of attributed to Kant. Maybe Kant is the best thinker who made it explicit, is to really cut off the subject from the object and to install this how should we call it, like a bar between thought and its object. This is like this can function as a stopgap to thinking, because if you have like a demarcation line about that you already know about subject and object, you're not gonna make those provisional definitive statements to which you have to commit to actually find out what their truth value is. And Hegel has super interesting comments about this in the sense of Aristotle's theory of the soul, which he actually views as superior to Kant's theory of the soul. And I think it has a lot to do with this. But anyway, I will just I will stop it here.
That's lovely. I'll give it to Mr. Fishman. I greatly enjoyed Layman Pascal's presentation. I like to imagine if I read enough philosophy, my soul is going to turn into the instruments at the end of Link's Awakening, where we wake up the windfish and the egg and plays the Ballad of the Windfish. That would be a dream come true. I lived on that game when I was 8. I really did. Also, too, it is interesting to think that when you build a chicken coop, you can like almost immediately tell if it works or not. You don't have this paranoia of I need to return and reread it like you do with Hegel, because I have that paranoia every day of rereading it. And it's funny how one of the reliefs of the chicken coop is it's almost more immediate. You can look, you can see, oh, it structurally is there. And then here's the thing, if that night a fox breaks into the chicken coop, you can kind of go out and see what was wrong. It's not like a guessing game, like, oh, the freaking didn't finish the fence, right? Well, with Hegel, you don't know. You don't know, which is precisely why there's this infinite creative possibility and infinite terror. Because when you start getting into the game of the words too, I have this all the time. I'm like, I don't know German. Oh my gosh, I'm reading the Bible. I don't know the freaking, oh my gosh, I'm at the mercy of the translator. That's another level of anxiety that comes onto it as well. And it's like, which all just begs the question, what do we do when we read? And I actually think reading, and then I'll give it to Mr. Fishman and Javier, reading, if we take Derrida seriously, that every word has an infinite deferral of difference. So there's like an absolute, an absolute skepticism, absolute like negativity at the bottom of every single word. And yet in reading that thing that has a kind of nothingness, the word cat, because there's a nothingness below the word cat because it's infinite deference, a meaning arises. So like the act of reading almost speaks to the collapse of the subject-object divide, right? And yet, in a Derridian sense, you almost can interpret like, oh, the subject has nothing to do with the object because the object's like meaning is always deferring away. But actually the very fact that you have a kind of abysmal nothing behind words in a way, and yet it's not, it's an affirmation at the end of the day, that negativity leads to an affirmation of the meaning of that word pointing to the phenomenon, actually then is a kind of Hegelian take on Derrida's point, in my opinion, because I find that very interesting. And then it's also interesting, I think this point that every negativity leads to an affirmation is actually brought out in this very thing of reading. Like when you read a book, like if you decide this book is a waste of time, it would be better to have a dialogue. From that negativity of reading is a waste of time, there's an affirmation of the dialogue. Or if you're like, oh, I can't capture everything in the book, I need to let it wash over me, then there's an affirmation from the negativity of like, oh, I'm just like nervously underlying everything. There's an affirmation of letting it wash over you. So like the relationship with the book itself kind of unveils that dialectical thinking has to move into speculative, like, because you're kind of dialectic. You're like, oh, if I'm trying to capture everything in the book, it's not washing over me and I'm nervous. So it's like, it's good to read, but then there's a nervous tick when I read. Dialectical dialectic, and you speculate. Well, maybe the speculation is the letting of the letting go. And now you've moved into a speculation of what that dialectic leads into. So it's reading books is one of the most for me personally, the reading of a book is one of the most fascinating phenomenological things to examine. And I think it's like a huge area of revelations about what humans are in general that has ramifications in all sorts of areas. And Derrida did inspire me to think that way. And I definitely think it's the case. But we don't have to worry about that with chicken coops. Mr. Fishman, please.
Well, you kind of have to worry about it with chicken coops because like the coyotes don't come every night. I mean, so you're sort of just there like, are they going to get in tonight? Like, is this going to work? I don't know.
Now with the shot, no, the drone, you get the drone. It just circles.
Yeah,
Then you want to worry about it.
That's a good idea. Anyways, I wanted to, in the spirit of circling back to see if we understand things, because we can wildly misunderstand things. I want to see if I understood what Dimitri, what you were saying, your quote from Zizek about Hegel, that like what I understood from what you're saying, and I might be like totally wildly off here, but it seems like he was addressing the dialectic between, on the one side, determinism, where subject and object are united, and so the idea of like a free choice is just an illusion, and really any change in subjectivity is really just a change in the object, versus a viewpoint in which subject and object are divided, and the subject acts upon the object in order to make the object in accordance with the subject's will, right? And then Hegel seemed to be trying to resolve that, like, because the question is, what does it mean to make a decision, right? And it's like, it seems like what you're saying is that the decision is the culmination of that dialectic or something. Like, I don't think I fully understood that third part. Like, I understood the dichotomy of determinism on the one side and a sort of free will on the other side. But like, what does it mean in Hegel to make a decision? Like, what is this resolution of the dialectic process that sort of just like makes decision happen, right? I don't know, maybe I'm totally off here, and if anyone else wants to jump in, but
yeah,
I was a little confused about that.
Well, I would say like this particular quote is really complex. I don't fully understand myself. That's why I'm also bringing it into conversation. But it specifically puts Hegel in relationship to Spinoza and Fichte, which is very interesting. And obviously they are like extremely intelligent and complex thinkers in their own terms. So yeah, like, I mean, I think we can say that for Hegel, it's not that system and freedom are apart from each other. It's not that yeah, the fact that God is omnipotent makes it that we don't have free will, to put it in this very simplistic way. But there's actually another quote that I can bring into the conversation. Maybe it won't help us make a sense of the previous one, but it's surely also an interesting direction that gets to an important topic. This one is a bit shorter. So that the truth is the whole, like Hegel said, means that we should not look at the process that is self-manifestation as a deprivation of the original being, nor should we look at it only as an ascent to the highest. The process is already the highest. The subject, for Hegel, is nothing but the active relationship to itself. In the subject, there is nothing underlying in its self-reference. There is only the self-reference. For this reason, there is only the process and nothing underlying it. Philosophical and metaphorical models such as emanation, Neoplatonism, or expression, Spinozism, present the relationship between the infinite and the finite in a way that fails to characterize what the process or self-manifestation is. So again, he goes into Spinoza, Spinoza, Neoplatonism, and German idealism, like the three preceding figures like Schelling, Fichte, and Kant are basically what Hegel's tackling. I feel like that's what you can see from the science of logic. Now, what's interesting about this quote is that, I think it's very nice that he makes the point that there's not a deprivation of an original being, which is, for example, that you can see in Rousseau, like, oh, we used to be kind of free, but then civilization corrupted us, so that entails like, oh, we should get back to that. And of course, this is an ideological mechanism you can see all over the place: religion, right, left wing. But also, there's not a naive progressivism. So it's not that we just go back to a being or that we just go upwards to some kind of being. The being is already kind of that process, and this is a self-referential process. So there's the fact that there's nothing underlying it just means that that it's abyssal, that it's kind of like, you're just freestyling in the void, in a sense. What for me is very interesting in this particular quote is like, you can read this quote and be like, okay, but is Hegel then just a solipsist? Because there's just the self-reference of the subject to itself. But then you get into the topics of like self-consciousness only being able to see itself as a self-consciousness by recognizing itself in another self-consciousness, etc. But like this still happens within self-reference, is another point you could make. But then again, this is probably that very dialectic, right? Like the same dialectic of negativity and affirmation.
Well, I'll make a comment and then pass it to Javier and Chitan. A way that I think about it. Now, first off, it should be interested that actually one of the funny things is that no one ever fully knows what any of these paragraphs mean. But that is like exactly the letting go that we're talking about with reading. Like there's this weird sense in which that the right way to approach a paragraph like that is not to overly try to understand every single word. So you let it overcome you and it like sits in your mind. And then it kind of circles around in that abyssal lack that then generates the meaning. This is actually very interesting because what we're talking about actually kind of gets into the analysis of a discussion like this on a meta level itself, like a net conversation, right? Like, how do conversations like this work? There's a similar thing like reading a book, where if you're trying to underline every line, you don't get it. And yet when you let it wash over you, you do get it in a kind of a weird way. And then it because you keep circling it and negating and sublating it and negating, sublating it in different things. And so there's something also that occurs where the moment you hear a paragraph like that, there's two errors. There's the error of, oh yeah, I get that. Well, that's a mistake. No, you don't. But then there's also the error of, that's stupid. I have no idea what it means, right? And that's an error too, because you're dismissing Zizek and you're saying, or Hegel, and there's nonsense there, right? There's this really weird middle zone of agreeing that there's something deep there, that you've also done enough work to apprehend some of the glimmers of that, while simultaneously not being overly hubris about the entire meaning of that paragraph. This is the weird let go thing that's going on. Like, so for example, when I hear that paragraph, I compare it with the strange like decision and determination, where determinations are like, that bookcase is the bookcase, right? It's like determined. I have the ability metaphysically of making a decision to see that bookcase as a potential cabinet to hold, it holds books right now, but I'm like, no, I'm going to make a decision for it to hold cups instead of books, right? So I can take a decision which is more metaphysical and change the determination of the bookcase into making it a cup holder. And so the decision translates something that's more abstract into determination. But then once I make it a cup holder, it's as if it always was a cup holder or always could have been a cup holder because it was always potentially there into the determination. And that transformation of the determination is thanks to the very abyssalness of the bookcase, meaning there's no absolute ground that makes it have to be a bookcase. which is precisely what's terrifying, but also makes it possible for decision from a subject to translate into the determinations of an object, and then suddenly vanish as if it was never, like the moment I decide it's a cup holder, it's as if it was always a cup holder, and it was always in the determinations. And so the decision immediately becomes abyssal in the changing of the determination, which is possible because the determination is abyssal. And this is what Hegel's always playing with, where the abyssalness of entities, by that I simply mean lack of ground, is precisely what makes it possible for decision to translate into determination and then seem as if there was no decision. So this is why judgment is big. And so what I see Hegel's critique of is a lot of philosophers are saying that like decision participates in a ground. Like when you make decisions, you're participating in the absolute truth, right? Like there's an expression of the absolute truth in the decision, like a kind of analogy of being or hierarchy, like we were talking last time or different thing, where Hegel is like, no. The very reason decision is metaphysical isn't because it is so much participating in an absolute preset notion of capital B being, but because there's an abyssalness that then decision can change determination and thus be metaphysical. That's the great reversal that's occurring. It's rather brilliant. But then, of course, it's not nihilist because you literally are creating a kind of metaphysical ground in that abyssalness. And then everyone gets kind of crazy. And actually, what's interesting to me is that double move is what you're doing in a metastructure of a conversation. You are constantly deciding, yes, I get that. I get there's value there in the determination of that paragraph itself, that then my ascribing to there being meaning there that I don't fully get is precisely what opens me up to getting the meaning there. And then I keep redeciding that paragraph, and which I can do because the words don't force me to understand them because of the Derridian difference. I'm not forced to understand the paragraph. Thus, that makes me have the ability to decide and choose my relationship to the paragraph, which then makes it possible to have this metaphysical revelation where it grows in meaning to me, and then I decide again, and its determination changes, and I decide again, back and forth. And yet what's so weird about that is that's only possible in the middle of the dialectic between I know what it means, I don't know what it means, and yet it's not merely that dialectic because that's purely negative. You have to say, because I know and don't know what it means, I speculate that it's worth making a decision to commit to this paragraph so you can have this movement occurring. So to me, that's like the act of reading itself kind of speaks to this entire Hegelian notion. The paragraph that we were reading in its very form speaks to our relationship to the paragraph. Which then I think speaks to the phenomenology of reading in general. But let me give it to Javier, Titan, and Zach. And then the question is, how can we use this for dating? Javier, how can you use this for the woman that's 10 years old? I think it could help your relationship.
So just to expand on what's been said, Hairut, and you might find my example more attractive or less attractive. It all depends on how you let go. I think the way Daniel framed it is the way I also frame love. I like to say this statement where like love is the one thing not offered and yet it demands an offering. So if you think about the story of Abraham and Isaac, it's a really funny thing because it's like, to me, the determination was already set that Isaac was never going to be offered. But you needed an offering to show that you were committed. And this is to me, this is like the funny, ironic part about it. Is like, that's exactly what love demands. It demands an offering for you to see that double negation into an affirmation of, actually, Isaac was never going to be offered. I just wanted to see if you were committed. You know, it's like this move of just like, I just wanted to see if you were going to choose me. I just wanted to see if you're going to be committed to me. That's it. And once you choose me, it kind of elaborates in that double negation. Because actually, my reading of Abraham and Isaac offering is that if Abraham would have chosen Isaac, he would have not chosen Isaac. He would have chosen himself. Because choosing Isaac would have been a selfish move. If you think about the context of it, right? He finally just he just had a son now. He's been years old, finally just had a son. And if he would have chosen Isaac in that moment, he would have been choosing himself, not Isaac. And that's the sort of ironic part. But if he would have chosen God, he would have chosen Isaac. This is the irony that I enjoy. Like, him choosing God was him choosing Isaac. But he had to do that move of like, yes, I'm committed to you and I'm going to offer this, and then it goes through a double negation. And I think this is exactly the way Daniel described like the determinations and so on, like the decision and the determination dialectic. So there's that. I know I took notes here, so I'm gonna pull it up because I was like, I need to talk about this stuff. Oh, I'm gonna introduce Badu here just a little bit because I'll be curious. How does math help us in letting go? Because obviously Badu takes mathematics as the ontology, set theory, and so on. So I'm like really curious. I don't know if anybody knows set theory. I'm just throwing it out there. And I know Daniel's like, but you know, we have been in the realm of hermeneutics, so I'm just curious. I do have Being an Event currently at my doorstep, so I will be spending a lot of time reading that text. But yeah, I'm just curious, does math help us in letting go?
Well, I'll give it to Titan and then Hybrid. I was going to say your love interest, who I'm going to call +10. I'm wondering if the best Valentine card ever would not be "I'll see you at the altar" +10, but "I'll see you on the altar," and it will be like, oh, that. So you know, that'd be good. And maybe there is something about mathematics where you let go of your phenomenological bias in favor of pure abstractions, and then kind of give yourself over them. But then the problem is precisely the effectiveness of math can then tempt you not to let go of them, and then you see everything in mathematics. But it's always dangerous, but there's lessons to be learned from everything, right? It's always the issue, like when you take a symbolic and then filter everything through the symbolic, as opposed to seeing it as a tool in the toolbox. But then that's a relation. It's all the relation to it in different things. So I'm going to make you some freaking Abraham Isaac Valentine's cards, and you should give them the +10. I think it's going to be great. Titan, please.
I just sort of got sort of a comment to make on letting go part of it. I can't claim to interpret the whole sort of tough paragraph there. I would have to read the text myself and go through it. But letting go is it's an interesting problem in some senses, and and it's a very interesting intersection between truth and love that you find in this sort of structuring which Hegel sort of gives us. One of the things with letting go is that if you look at this question of superego in some senses, and you understand that for any libidinal investment that ego has, when it has to let go of the libidinal investment, what it usually does is that it internalizes it through the law of the superego. That's what essentially happens. That the libidinal investment hasn't been let go. It has sort of come from another space as a structure, as a split between the ego itself, so the superego gets formed. So I think one thing that we can very clearly see is that it's very difficult for a human being to let go of a libidinal investment. There is something over there that when we try and let go of a libidinal investment, we actually are capable of putting ourselves more invested in that same libidinal structure, which is why this relationship in Jusant and superego sort of comes across every time in Lacan, and so on and so forth. That the very law of the superego can become can have this strange sort of compromise with the id, in that sense that you are able to enjoy the law of the superego in that there's something perverse in that, So if for example, if I say I will never commit murder, at some point of applying that law or that value, I would be getting the same enjoyment as I would get by committing a murder. At some point, these two things meet. There's a problem there, isn't it? So it's not that I have been able to let go of my libidinal investment of committing a murder by simply internalizing the value that I should not commit a murder. And that is what Nietzsche's problem with value sort of emerges as, isn't it? So in that context, Hegel's question of the absolute becomes extremely interesting, because absolute actually intersects with this problem that at what point are we able to, in some sense, finding a way forward from this double bind in some senses. and we get very interesting sort of structures from it. Love is what somebody did not ask that we cannot give. Those kind of structures emerges from this problem at some fundamental level, that our libidinal investment does not get absorbed in anything simply by giving it a structure of value, whether it's murder, stealing, whatever. Nietzsche saw it, Hegel saw it, Lacan, Freud, Lacan sort of course, conceptualized it in various ways. And the question becomes then, and we know that till the point we are liminally, and this is the point where desire and truth sort of find its very strange kind of cut across each other in that sense, because science sort of has this fantasy of getting truth without any subject, isn't it? It's a truth which is universal, common, all of that. And Hegel very clearly saw that doesn't work. Truth by its very functioning sort of always involves a minimal of that excess which we call subject in that sense. And as long as that minimal excess remains something like the problem of desire, and by drive or superego, would sort of hound that problem from within. And thus the problem of truth then doesn't become simply sort of going and finding out what exists outside a scientific enterprise and seeing and knowing. But the problem of truth itself becomes of releasing that tension that subject has with its own self. There's something about that activity of you able to release that tension, that very idea of being subject has with your own self. And what is at stake in that release? What is the process for that? How do we think through that problem? I think that's a good way to frame that kind of a issue. I'm not
That's brilliant. It makes me think of Dimitri's comment on absolute and absolving, which is very interesting. But quickly, I see the enjoyment that Javier is getting, like a murderer, out of not murdering. I see it in your eyes, Javier. You watch out. You don't do that. Mr. Fishman, please.
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good point about how like the libidinal investment doesn't go away through prohibition. I think that relates to what Javier was saying too about the Abraham and Isaac story, right? That like it's interesting that the Jews will interpret that story as like, this is how God revealed to the Jewish people that he doesn't want human sacrifice, right? And it's like he revealed it to them by making Abraham go through all the process of a human sacrifice, right? It's like, that doesn't make sense. By participating in it, he's showing that that's not what he wants, right? So it's kind of like this strange move there. And yeah, I mean, that story is full of mystery. But going back to this idea of like the determinacy of the object that Daniel was saying, maybe I should just let this one go. I don't know, but I'm still trying to like wrestle with this idea of like, okay, so I get what you're saying, that the bookcase is a bookcase, but it's all like bookcase has no grounding, and so because of that abysmal nature of language, it's like we can both recognize it as a bookcase, but we can also imagine it as something else, right? And so my question, though, is where does change come from? Like, where does the will for you to change the bookcase into a cupboard start from, right? Is that merely an unfolding of mechanistic, deterministic processes? Or is there some kind of free will that like, because if it's indeterminate, then it's just like, what is it, just random? Like, is it just, does the change from bookcase to cupboard just spontaneously come forth out of the void? Or is there some, I mean, because it's not random, and even if it were random, randomness would still be the principle at play, making it into a cupboard as opposed to a table or all the other things it could be, right? So that's still my question, is like, I get what you're saying, and it is a brilliant move that like it's not some like absolute being that everything is supposed to be organized into in some sort of Platonic way, but it's like, then okay, is it just like noise coming forth from the void without any causation or any principle to it, right? Like, I don't know if I'm framing the question right, but that's
can I just
what,
respond to this?
yeah, please.
Because this question that you are asking, I'm asking myself basically this question in another form every time Hegel comes up with another logical category in the science of logic. I'm like, where the hell are you getting this from? For example, like here, he's saying for the first time the relationship of substantiality passes over into the relationship of causality. Why? He didn't use the word causality before this. Then he comes up, and so he's doing this like for all the, you know, how many pages is this book? It's way too long, but he's doing this all the time. And like the funny thing is, like, so when you read that for the first time, you get completely hysterical because you know it's not just random, because otherwise it wouldn't have been called the science of logic. Like, it's not called the randomness of contingency or whatever. But like, it's funny because when you read it for the one time and you go back and read it, then it actually can fall into place more, and you're like, yeah, of course it works like this. So this is where really the notion of retroactivity, this is why I believe Hegel, especially Zizek, brings it out explicitly, the notion of the retroactive emergence of meaning. Now, of course, we have all this Vervaeke stuff, Neoplatonism, but for Freud, meaning is a stopgap on the unconscious. Meaning emerges because meaninglessness is the worst of all. So an example that Zizek gives is that there's actually Jews who have this kind of Old Testament view of why the Holocaust happened, and they say that, yeah, God punished us, all of this. And of course, that's horrible. Like, that's horrible to believe in, that actually, you know, when you're a Jew. But this is still better than to say it's just completely meaningless, that the Holocaust is just meaningless. So meaning always emerges retroactively for us. And the crazy thing here is that, of course, you can do phenomenology, you can do ethics, different philosophical disciplines. But for Hegel, this is kind of like logic is primary here. So it's really weird when you're reading this book and there's like new terms coming up, and you're like, okay, but how does that make sense? And you go back to it and like, okay, then you can see more what's going on then. But there's no way to Zizek also talk about the German word unhintergehbar. It's like that means you cannot go behind it. So it means we're stuck in this process, right? Where it's like, yeah, we know it's not. I know when Hegel was writing this, like, the new categories don't just emerge out of nowhere, but then also they kind of do, or at least that's how they appear to me. So every time he will say something like, even at the beginning of the book, he will say, yeah, pure being is just immediacy. Well, of course it's immediate. You just wrote it down. I'm just reading it right now. Of course it's not mediated. And then you'll say, yeah, we will have to mediate this logically, and then only then will it, like, not the mere notion will come out, but like what it actually is in and for itself. So I think Hegel's kind of like, he wants us to tarry with this question. I think that's something.
That's a tremendous question, and everything you just said, I think there's actually something about Hegel that of itself kind of follows the Owl of Nineveh thing, where you can only interpret the past. Likewise, you have to go through Hegel to then interpret Hegel, but then you just wonder if you're now confirmation bias, right? That sort of tension of the conspiracy you're in. But that is what's weird, is there's a revelation that problem of, I call that the problem of internally consistent systems. The problem is conspiracy, worldview, philosophy books, they all have the same structure. The paranoia ones and the true ones and the worldview ones. And the question is why? And what does that say? And the inability to make those distinctions has an abysmal nature to it. But then why? What is the abysmal open up? But before getting into what you were saying, Mr. Fishman, because I think you're putting your finger on the fun question, Mr. Javier Rivera, tell us more about the plus 10. Hair color, eyes, occupation.
I think Hiroot, he's reminding me of a paper that I wrote already, where I talked about this division between choice and chance. And I talked about how choice and chance is really interesting because from the subject's point of view, they're making a choice. But from the exterior point of view, it's a probability and a chance of this choice, right? So there seems to be this ironic thing happening here about your own question, where it's like we're trying to be like, okay, so where is this origin, so to speak? And then yet there's this ironic tension between, choice and chance. The probability of me discovering this new idea about the bookcase and then me suddenly just choosing to do the bookcase. Like, it's so ironic that even when we look at environmental factors, if we frame them in a certain way, we can almost increase the chances of you coming up with the idea of arranging the bookcase in a certain way. You know what I mean? And yet, again, there is this tension between choice and chance. Like, for me, it's like the same side. It's like two sides of the same coin, essentially. And that's how I looked at it, because it's such a funny thing, and I definitely hate the word random, because I feel like it's a epistemological escape. It's just random. I've always hated that term. But Chetan definitely nailed something there about, what is this? I think, what is this? How did you say it, Chetan? I think this tension between truth and desire, or something like that. My immediate response was like irony. It just, like, to me, like, there's no solution to this, at least right now. The way I'm currently understanding it is irony. Like, I'm like reading Badu just so I can see if there's irony. Like, I'm like wanting to know, like, okay, does he come to this ironic conclusion? Because for me, like, nothing makes sense unless it's ironic. In some ways. Yeah. Yes, Kierkegaard is very interesting here. And even if we take the biblical narrative, right, or just the Abrahamic narrative of that we were made in God's image, let's just entertain this for idea, right? The idea that God is an excess, let's just take that as an assumption, and yet we become an image of the excess, the reflection of the excess. Isn't that funny that we would be both simultaneously lack and excess as a reflection? Like, to me, this is the point of the human being. Like, we're just so ironic human beings, of being both lack and yet excess, and it just makes no sense, when we try to, like, logically pin it down, right? So yeah, those are my thoughts and my proposals.
Can I just respond to that one too? Because this is where the distinction between the understanding and reason is very interesting. Because for the understanding, yeah, if something if something doesn't hold up to the law of non-contradiction, it doesn't make sense, and therefore doesn't make sense. It's just indeterminate randomness. And I've kind of the same thing that you have. Like, I don't like the term random. When someone's like, "Oh, I'm so random doing this random thing," I'm like, no, that's your immediacy is mediated. That's always the case. But whereas when you read, for example, the chapter on infinity and finitude, Hegel will talk about the bad infinity, which is conceptualized, when the way most people think about infinity, that whereas our concrete existence is just finite, God is infinite, and then you have this grand image of the infiniteness of God. For Hegel, this infinity as such is also finite because it's opposed to finitude, and thereby it's restricted from finitude, so it's a finitized infinite. Now, he also has a way of, like, infinitizing finitude, because since finitude lends its meaning from infinity, that means there's a certain infinitization occurring there, an elevation of finitude in that movement. But the point that I was wanting to make is that what you can do with reason for Hegel is that you gather all those thoughts together of infinity and finitude, and you can conceptualize that as the true infinity. Like, the self-differentiation of the concept, for example, is infinite, or spirit is infinite, because even though that it, like, manifests as maybe like a multiplicity or like a logical movement of finite determinations, that very process is principally truly infinite. So what I find also very interesting is that when Hegel goes from the dialectic of being and nothing, being is nothing, nothing is being, So they are as a becoming in this immediate transition to one another. But then he goes to the concept of existence, and he says existence or Dasein is actually to grasp this becoming itself as a moment. So to fill, if you fill and gather like the mutual contradictory nature of logical moments, then indeed we would stop at like, okay, it doesn't make sense. Like A equals A is transgressed and therefore it's just indeterminate, to like being able to see like the necessity of a notion self-othering as being contained in different categories. Also, of course, the notion of concrete universality is important here, because things are only themselves through not being able to be themselves. And this is also very important, right? Because some people, they are totally stuck with saying, yeah, we don't have a democracy at all, because look around, it's obvious that it's not a true democracy. Whereas if you want to get a higher level understanding of politics, you need to at least incorporate the idea that democracy fails as such, yes, but it's in this very failure that it thrives, just like capitalism and many other ways, like the sexuality, you know. It's like the non-relation is primary. The fundamental negativity is primary, and its manifestations, its expressions are secondary means that try to cover over this negativity. In like, you know, finite contradictory manners that will never like seal the gap, or will never solve it, or will never have the word that, or like the woman who will fix that for you. So that's also yeah, that's really special about Hegel, like this, the fact that whenever reason as we think of it seems to be torn down, we can actually reasonably comprehend it as well, if we allow it to let go and conceptualize it as a moment as well.
On this question of the difference, I really like the point that absolute also entails absolve, and also where Chetan was talking about the enjoyment and with the sacrifice of Abraham. It's very interesting, because basically what I think we see in Hegel is an understanding that if all you have is the idea of absolute knowing, there's no absolving yet. Like the desire of just knowing absolute knowing. So you could almost make, in order for absolute, let me just use the language, in order for the absolute to be an absolving of desire or negation sublation into a different form, you have to experience the phenomenological journey. You have to go on the experience of actually encountering the limits of knowledge, right? If you only have the idea that knowledge is limited, the enjoyment is still kind of hidden there in a problematic and also potentially pathological way. It's when you actually experience the limits of thought that then it becomes an absolving. And Hegel's basically like, you can't even start the science of logic until you experience absolute knowing, which is the limits of thought. And then that becomes the foundations for new thinking, right? I think similarly, that goes to what is being said on the sacrifice story. Like, it's like God telling people, hey, don't human sacrifice. They're like, okay, we shouldn't, but secretly they're still going to want to do it. It's like, okay, fine. I'm going to command someone to actually go through the experience of it. And now it becomes an absolving. Now you're absolved of the want to sacrifice, because there's a story of it. And basically what Kierkegaard, in my opinion, in Fear and Trembling is doing is literally taking a bunch of Western Christians, or because he's speaking in Christianity, who have gotten too comfortable with the story and don't really experience it when they read it. And so so it really is just secretly an enjoyment in the story of knowing the ending, right? Because he's like, no, really think about you being told to sacrifice your son, like really get into it. And maybe it can turn into an absolving or a transformation of your relationship to the enjoyment in the story, from thinking, oh, I know how it all works out, to an actual like, oh, reordering desire so that it's not having a more perverse function that's going on. And so there's, I think, a deep understanding, and then I'll give it to Javier and anyone else who wants to speak at the end, and then I'll talk on the free will thing, because I think that's really important, is that if all you have is an idea of the absolute, then it only functions as an absolute. And then unfortunately, you can feel like you're absolute because you get a perverse enjoyment from that idea. It has to transfer into experience. The idea has to lead into an experience of the absolute. And then the perverse enjoyment is like, oh, I'm actually limited in what I can think. Oh, I'm not all knowing. Oh, how do I find an enjoyment in humility? Ah, now there's an ordering of it, right? Where you're working on the ego to find an enjoyment in the fact that there has to be a certain depth of the ego, or a certain humbling that is actually a letting go that's a letting go, not just an enjoyment of being someone who lets it go. Like, that's the difference. Like, we're saying how there's this problem of finding enjoyment in letting go, and then therefore it's not actually letting go. In order for letting go to even let go of the letting go, there has to be an experience. The idea has to lead to an experience. The idea of letting go has to lead to an experience of letting go. And you almost have to carry out that practice regularly and often in order to keep experiencing that. And then actually, arguably, that's the entire structure of what we're saying with the conversation, where you let stuff roll over you, you're experiencing the letting go, not just the idea. Like, it's one thing to say, oh yeah, I know I don't know everything. It's entirely something else to be in a conversation where you're confronted with the fact that you don't know what every paragraph says or what everyone is saying, and you have to experience it. Likewise, reading a book where you let it wash over you, like Javier was saying, that right there is a kind of practice of having the absolute limit, the absolute become an absolving. So then you are checking yourself, so you're avoiding a perversion and trying to reorder your relation to it. So there's something about the after these conversations, and reading itself with. But let me give to Javier and Dimitri, and then anyone else, and then the free will stuff.
You know, this is why I feel like irony really has like the only good answer to what you're talking about, Daniel. Because to go from irony to experience, and I'm gonna bring up Romans, where literally Paul is like, hey, I can't do this stuff. I want to do good, but I keep doing bad. I keep doing the one thing I don't want to do. He's like in lament over this. And for me, the only way to translate the idea into the experience is to embrace this statement. I do it because I can't do it. Like, to me, I enjoy this statement completely. Like, I am following this religion because I can't do it. That's why I'm doing it. Like, it doesn't put me on any like ethical ground higher than the normal person that doesn't believe in this. I do it because I can't do it. Yeah, I get married because I can't do it. And you know, even this notion of commitment, like he committed murder, like this is like, you can already tell, like, even commitment is a kind of violence. Like, yes, I know I can't do it, but I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it anyways. So I really do feel like when it comes to this translation from dang, Daniel, you're going off. I feel like when it goes from this translation from idea to experience, it has to be that kind of epistemological ground. Like, I do it because I can't do it. And it's like just this ironic embrace anyways. And for me, like, this is the only way you can let go, right? Like, they're like, why are you doing this? You know, eating pork, it doesn't make any sense. Like, why are you like not eating pork anymore? It's like, well, I do it because I can't do it. Like, that's it. There's nothing else to it. I'm just trying, even though I know I can't do it. And for me, like, this is the irony of humility. Like, that is the translation of like actual humility. It's like the very fact of like, in my efforts to be humble, I cannot do it. And yet that realization is the humble moment for you. Like, there's your humility in that moment. Yeah.
No, and I'll give it to Dimitri. So then the Hegelian move is, okay, we're always stuck in irony. Likewise, we're always stuck in dialectic, and then to speculate why. For Kierkegaard, it's because we're fallen Christian structure. And then for Hegel, it's like, okay, well, why is it you have this dialectical structure? And that gets into the how things are as nature, notion, and freedom. But let me give it to Dimitri.
Yeah, Javier, I like what you said there, because I've recently been, since a few months, creating some art, and I always fail. I can never do it, and this is, but I keep doing it because I can. So that's yeah. I think there's always such an importance to the, like, we're like the recent quote I read, like, yes, we're always stuck in our active self-reference, but that activity of the self-reference also consists of the trying to get out of this self-reference. And by doing this, you can actually, you know, create beautiful things or also destroy things. You know, it's the same power. I recently watched this video. It's a documentary. They were interviewing different artists on creativity and addiction, and they also said kind of the same thing. They said, yeah, like the thing that makes me create the art that people find great is the same thing that that makes me hate my life and suffer and all of this. And so yeah, that's yeah, it's like, especially like, yeah, if you can turn this into irony, like I love when hip-hop doesn't take itself too seriously. I absolutely love that. Now that we're on the topic of hip-hop, actually, you know, in the beginning of the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel says, yeah, philosophy actually, in the preface he says, yeah, philosophy should not be prefaced. And then he writes in the preface why it should not be prefaced and all that kind of stuff. Now, in rap culture is extremely dialectical, because you will find a lot of times that rappers will say, this is not rap. in their rap song, they will say, this is not rap, or stuff like this. I even read it in like a Spotify biography of someone. He said like, yeah, I don't need a biography, and then like his biography was kind of long, and so I think this is yeah, I really think that's that ironic stance is really important. Now, Daniel, that's what you said really gets to the question of mediation, you know, and Hegel goes into this in the forward, like Cadell managed to emphasize so many times in the course on Science of Logic, that what you're actually doing by mediating like the limits of your knowledge and actually encountering like, oh shit, I don't know, instead of like, yeah, just having the idea of I don't know, it's like you actually encounter it, is that you're mediating instinct with this, and like along with like making your soul into an instrument and mediating instinct. To me, philosophy is definitely something like spiritual, in the sense that it's not just a way of life. It's not just like trying to get to know more, or like trying to make you think differently in some kind of ideological structure, but really to also experiment with how can you mediate instinct, and to what extent can you do this with your thinking.
Beautiful. I am quite aligned with that understanding of a role of philosophy, because that's also David Hume. A role of philosophy is not to get some sort of absolute ground for what you believe, but to defend what you believe, and also to have a healthy relationship with what you believe, so that you don't become thoughtless and brainwashed by banality of evil and so on and so forth. So philosophy, the risk for David Hume of philosophy, as you know from the present, is that you discover the absolute groundlessness of everything, that makes you pathological and absolute skepticism and enter into philosophical melancholia. But then, of course, without philosophy, you can't defend yourself from big ideas that somebody has coming into your town on how to make things better. You also can't think about the fact that you don't know everything. So when you encounter the fact that you don't know everything, you're going to have a pathological response, right? That's basically what's going on. Like if you think through the fact that you're finite and take that seriously, but also not end up in like, oh, I'm finite, therefore I'm determined, and I'm mere causation and random. Well, that's philosophical melancholia. You know, you're like, oh my gosh, what's the point? You become a fatalist. But then also you want to take finitude seriously, precisely because it is groundless, and you're going to inevitably encounter your limits. And so you respond to those limits well, and you can actually integrate with them or create with them, as opposed to become hopeless, right? And this is the move that Hume is playing with, that Hegel is playing with. That's all very interesting. But then of course, this arises as this very, very strange question. How can you talk about limits that are truly limits and not be limited by those limits? How can you talk about determination and also still have freedom, right? Because the moment you start saying, well, I can make a decision to change the determination of the book self, there's the question of where and how and where does it come from? All right, well, religiously, this was posited by saying there's a God who gives you free will. Therefore, there is some sort of creative agent that is part of human causation that participates in causation, but is not reducible to causation, right? And you say, okay, well, what if we don't believe in that? And then obviously a lot of atheism is indeed, like a Sam Harris or whatever, becomes more deterministic. Now, what's very strange with someone like Sam Harris, because there's a paper we did called Choosing Determinism, and what does it mean to choose determinism as a hermeneutical lens by which to think through things? Because if you choose determinism, you're not determined, right? So Sam Harris goes to great length to argue that determinism is not fatalism. Just to say that we're determined does not mean we don't have zero control over what happens. Oh, so it's not determinism? Like, so what is it? It's an emphasis debate. I actually think one of the great mistakes is the phrase free will, because free will sounds like total free will, meaning you have freedom over everything that happens to you, when I don't know of a single philosopher who has ever used the phrase free will to mean like God freedom, like you literally are not bound by space and time. Free will just means will. Do you have will? If there is a will, it is kind of free to some, if it is meaningfully will as opposed to want. Now, if it's just want, then it may just be a response to stimulation, because you want that and that's just environmental. But if the word will has some sort of meaning and it's not merely a simile for want, then there has to be some sort of agency that's involved, right? Now, the question becomes, what is that agency? What is the basis for believing in that agency? And why do we think it might be there? I'll give it to Chitan. There's more to be said on this, because basically what ends up happening, Hegel wants to propose, if you have the variability to have thought follow itself dialectically, then thought is not bound by determination. He wants to place freedom very much in the mental act versus the movement of the hand. Another way to look at this is, instead of asking, am I free to write the word cat on a piece of paper, are you free to interpret what the meaning of the word cat means? Like, are you, like, when I see the word cat, I may think of the barn cat down at the barn, or the cat I had when I was a kid. Someone else may read the word cat and they may think of like a lion or something, right? Is that an expression of freedom in the interpretive act? Now, notice what's so interesting about that, because then there's another question. Well, wait, you're not free because you're forced to interpret cat. Okay, well, let's say it's a blank piece of paper. Are you more free with a blank piece of paper? If you are a writer, yes. But if you're a reader, no. The identity of the thing determines if freedom is present more so in a blank piece of paper, or when there's present one word that is not as contextually bound. So if I have a sentence that says, the cat is orange and walking down the street, there's less freedom as a reader than if there's just the word cat, which then you can interpret in many different ways, right? But then also there's less direction, so you may not know how to use your freedom because you don't know how to interpret the word cat as walking down a street or walking down a road. So it's very important. The first step that has to be made in this question is the act of interpretation free, or more free, or different in its unfolding than the act of writing a word on a piece of paper? And is that relative to the mode of the entity that is approaching and understanding the phenomenon? And this is why for Hegel, following the notion dialectically leads to the question of, okay, if ideas are able to unfold dialectically, what kind of being must we be for ideas to so unfold? Because that is what we have to ask if we are indeed free or not, because that's how we determine the mode of which we are experiencing that phenomenon, if we're a reader or if we're a writer. That was a giant mouthful, but basically it comes to ontological questions of what we are, and then this is where I'm going to talk about how he's going to kind of basically argue that nature and notion are somehow linked as a dialectical monad, and therefore they're dialectically a single substance that are relate but are not totally bound by the other, but are determined by the other, but not in a fatalistic way. Yeah. So that's, but let me give, that's like whole gating different thing. But Mr. Teton.
Yeah, I'll just quickly sort of say something on this. I can't resist it. I want to go to sleep in that sense. But I remember Zizek having a very nice lecture where he sort of pointed out that this question of freedom, that today, we have these brain tests that we have found out that our brain knows before what we are going to do. So even before the thought sort of comes to your mind, you can have a test which will tell you that your brain knows what you're going to do before that thought sort of occurred to you, and that sort of becomes an argument against free will. But there's something interesting there that Zizek said, that yet you always have a choice to say no, and the freedom lies in your ability to say no in that sense. And intuitively one can see that there's a very nice link between negation and freedom here, which is a very, very important one, because your freedom is structured through negation rather than simply through saying, this or and this in that sense. And freedom is actually a very interesting thing, that it's either there or not. This question of absolute freedom is a very, very badly placed question, because if there is even a little bit of freedom, even if there is a very small amount of thing that you can call that you are actually free, then that actually changes the texture of everything else. That gives you a space to account, influence, So it is either you are free in the smallest way possible or not. That is what is at stake. The freedom is not a question of whether you're completely free or not. That's a stupid debate. The debate is that whether there is the smallest possible thing which you can say to be something to be free or not. Because if there is a small possibility, then everything else gets changed because of that. And there is something at stake in that, thinking. Yeah, I'll just stop here. Yeah.
Well, let me give it Javier. To your point, again, a lot of it seems to be an emphasis debate, like with Sam Harris or any of the people talking about free will and determinism. It's like, no, we're more free than not. No, we're less free than so. Okay, well, then it's a percentage debate, right? Like, not even Sam Harris wants to say determinism is fatalism. Then what does the word determinism mean? Like, it's not clear what that means. Likewise, why do we say free will versus just will if we're not totally free? Like, there seems to be a lot of emphasis debate going on, but let me give it to Javier.
Actually, this goes back to my paper on anxiety, where, I was telling that older woman that I'm talking to, I was like, yeah, I wrote this paper and it's called Anxiety as the Possibility is Freedom. And it totally stunted her. She's like, what? And I enjoyed that sort of ironic reaction, because I was like, yes, I'm meaning exactly that. Anxiety is the possibility of freedom. But yes, Sam Harris seems to have run into that problem of, like, he couldn't accept the fatalistic approach, because then he comes into that ethical question of, like, oh, so it's just determined that I'm going to kill this guy, so why do I have to go to jail? So he still had to say, like, yes, you have a little bit, like, you can still choose, like, because he had to escape that kind of accusation. He couldn't escape that accusation, so he had to say that. And even Baumeister believes that free will, because he's a psychologist, it goes back to percentages, like Daniel was talking about. I wrote my whole paper on critiquing Baumeister for this reason, is that he goes, oh, as psychologists, we can only engage in what is more free acts and less free acts. And he succumbs the will to us preserving our instincts in order to live in society. So basically, our will is already contained in this energy system that is draining itself because it's trying to live in society. So for Baumeister, there is limited will because you're already in an energy consuming system. So to make a rational decision is already kind of overtly too much energy to produce, to consume, to use. And what's funny about this is that I say, my paper is like, there's something sugar-free that I can find in this thing. Because he said, like, oh, the subjects that they studied was that if they consumed more sugar, then they were able to have enough energy to make a rational decision. But for me, I was like, this notion of limited will, I totally disagree with, because it's already predicated on what Daniel's talking about. This notion of free will as this sort of absolute thing. So that's why I disagreed with this notion of limited will, because it's already predicated on this misunderstanding of free will. So that's why I actually enjoyed Luther's argument a little bit more, because it was about the awareness of the bonds is what makes you free. It's the very fact that it's this notion that there is a paper in front of you and there are so many ideas that can do this. It's that realization of, like, yes, the paper limits me and these are my options. Like, that's free will. And that's why I enjoyed Chetan when he said, like, Zizek's idea of, like, there's something about freedom that has a sort of negativity to it. It's when I realize the limit that I am free in some ways. And for me, that's the little bit of freedom that we have. And that's what I was arguing And I argue that through anxiety, because anxiety for me is the phenomenological experience of that limit. Here is the limit of the imaginary relation you have with your own identity. Now you're anxious about it. There it is, right there. The possibility of freedom is right there, because like Lacan argues, the investment in the image cannot be fully captured. There's always an excess libidinal thing. And that's what he calls the objet, at least that's from what I understand. So anxiety is outside the frame, right? You're sort of stuck in the mirror, but anxiety is outside the frame. So already anxiety is the limits of this idea. So yeah, I destroyed Baumeister. I hated him for that reason.
So there's a few things. Please tell me that when you first asked +10 on a date and you're like, I know you're feeling anxious right now, which means I set you free, which means you really should go on a date on me because I'm your liberator. I really hope that that's how you got her to go on your first date, because that would be amazing. So there's a few things. What's very interesting is also there's an entire school of thought called illusionism, which believes that there is no such thing as free will. But we can't teach people determinism because there's tons of evidence that shows that if you tell people they're determined, they become like more immoral. Like that's well studied. Like people who believe in determinism are more likely to act immorally because they're not responsible for this action. So these people are like, okay, determinism is true, but we can't teach determinism because then society is going to be destroyed. So you're telling me that what you teach people changes what they do. Oh, that's interesting. That only makes sense if people have some control over their actions, right? And Sam Harris is the same way. What he's trying to say is like, look, and a lot of people say this, they say free will was a doctrine of control, because if you tell people they're responsible, like they're free, then when their life sucks because the system oppresses them, you can say it's their responsibility and it's a way the system can maintain control, right? There's a strong argument actually to be said that free will can be used as a doctrine to oppress people, because if people's lives suck and it's the system's fault, you can say it's their fault so they won't oppose the system, right? So there's some legitimacy to that, which is why we have to be aware that there's a difference between the question of is there something like free will and how free will might be used as a tool of power to maintain its power, right? So there's all sorts of different questions. But what's so interesting is when you get into the weeds of the conversation, it is an emphasis debate. It does always seem to be an emphasis debate. But the question still kind of stands on, if we're saying there's something like will, what is the source of said will, right? Well, in religion, it's God. Now, there's a number of schools now that will talk about emergentism. They'll say, okay, physics emerged to mind. Well, physics, I know Bard has a, but he's not just Bard. There's a lot of people who are emergentists that say, okay, brain emerged to mind. Mind is not reducible to brain. It operates according to principles that are not totally bound by brain. Therefore, there's some degree of freedom between the brain and mind, between physical and metaphysical, or physical and consciousness, right? That's a potential model. You can argue that's false. You can argue that's true. That's a debate. Another model is theological. And then what you get, like the question of where does the freedom come in Hegel, like what is the source of it, is the weird question of nature and notion seem to have a relation to one another. The idea of the bookcase has something to do with the structure of the bookcase as an object that then makes it knowable. And in the space between the determination of the bookcase and my ability to think about it, emerges a certain freedom of my ability to shape the determinism that is the structure of the frickin' universe itself, because the universe is it is a kind of, as I understand it, it is a kind of nature/notion. It is a monad of a constant relation at this point where once the human consciousness emerges, where nature and notion are always in a conversation with one another. And in that conversation is precisely the space of freedom. But this is also, though, why Hegel emphasizes negativity, because all freedom immediately is dressed in causation. The moment I create a sandcastle, I create it with sand in physics, and it's susceptible to causation. So this is the problem. The phrase I always like to say is that freedom is always dressed in determinism. Like all manifestations of freedom is immediately translated into a phenomenological experience that is physics, dang it, unless it's purely in my head. But then if it's purely in my head, is it free? It's stuck in my head, right? So then you translate it into the world, of which then translates it into physics, into a sandcastle that then makes it susceptible to a wave hitting it, right? Oh, and also, if I have a brain that emerges to a mind, the only way I can experience mind is as brain, which is susceptible to causal forces. So you can never observe freedom, per se. only the translations of freedom into determination, which then you can only observe the determination that makes it seem like freedom had no effect whatsoever. So, for example, if we make a distinction between creation and causation, creation always manifests into causation as if it is just causation, right? The moment I create a sandcastle, I have now created an object that is in causation as if there was no creativity involved. So it's gone, right? So it's gone. The very manifestation of freedom is a negation. Boom. A way to so then what Hegel has to do is go through and give examples of where there would be reason to think there was something there, ergo freedom, that is gone the moment you look for it, right? In a way I describe it, when I come up to you and say, hey, do you want to go to the movies? And you really don't want to go to the movies, you feel you've lost something. You've lost the freedom. You can no longer exist in a world where I don't ask you to go to the movies. And once I ask you, there's the possibility of, oh crap, what if Daniel was mad if we don't go to the movies? And oh, I'm a bad person if I'm not a good friend. I have literally, here's the funny move. I have forced you almost deterministically into a world where you either have to say yes or no to my movie invitation, and you experience the loss of that world in that very act, right? Anxiety, exactly. So something is gone, but you never see the freedom go. It's just gone. It's always negative. You see what I'm saying? Like you don't, because freedom always manifests in terms of causation that it is dressed in, that you can always plausibly deny is freedom, ergo just causation, but you feel the difference in the act of anxiety. That's why like Sartre wants to like really base his argument for freedom in the act of being in prison. Like, you know, there's a difference between being in prison and walking down the street, right? You know, you've lost something. And yet when you're asked, what did you lose? All you have is determinations and causations to point to. So it doesn't seem like you lost anything. So you say, oh, I'm determined then, right? Because freedom is a thing that is not reducible to causation. Like there was this wonderful point made where there's a problem of random. What's the problem with the word random, right? Because there's no such thing like chance is not a cause. Like if you say, oh, the universe came into existence by chance. Chance is not a cause, and yet we act like chance is a cause, right? There has to be something behind it. But likewise, problematically, freedom is never in a vacuum. Freedom is always manifest into determinations that make it the free not totally free. So we only ever know freedom in terms of an incompletion, which makes it therefore seem like it's not free because it's not totally free, right? So then what ends up happening, it becomes an emphasis. But this is why the paper on choosing determinism wants to argue that it would be easy if we could say we were totally free or if we were totally determined, but instead we have to choose determinism and choose freedom. And we're always going to be tempted to use determinism to hide us from the things we don't want to be responsible for, and to choose freedom when we want to be responsible for it. So we have to be very, very self-skeptical of ourselves and be careful when we choose determinism and when we choose freedom, right? But we're always going to be in that between space, because freedom always manifests into a determination or causation that makes it seem like freedom is not there. And the last way I'll describe this is I go back in Hegel on the question of the source of this freedom. By constantly making the move of, say, moving the infinite into the finite, where the finite is precisely an infinite relation with itself, like a circle, and I like to say the infinite in parentheses, right? In the same way, what ends up happening there is the finite is something that is always trying to find creation in itself and can only find causation. But precisely because it is free, it can always keep trying to find freedom. So thus it must be free. Because if you can keep trying to find freedom, you must have a freedom to keep trying to find it. And when you always encounter your limit of being unable to find it, that means you were freely trying, but you only ever experience freedom in the vanishing of it. It's gone. You know you had freedom because something's gone. It's like there must have been an Eden because I lost it, right? And yet there never was a pure freedom of which you could directly experience and know absolutely at freedom. There was only ever the experience of the limitation of the freedom that only makes sense if there's a freedom to be limited, right? And so another way, the last way I'll put it, if I were to try to describe what I understand the very kind of ontological nature of the cosmos, whatever the frick that means, if we were to tie it to the reading, writing different things. So for example, you got a blank piece of paper, okay? You have the freedom of writing the word cat, all right? But then that freedom, once you write the word cat, you as a writer are less free, okay? Because now there's the word cat. It's on the piece of paper. There's a limiting of possibility. You understand what I'm saying? But as a reader, you now gain freedom because there's a word to interpret, okay? You had less freedom as a reader, there was less freedom on the blank sheet of paper, but more freedom as a writer, But once you write the word cat, you have more freedom of a reader. You understand what I'm saying? And then now let me ask you this. What if you are both a reader and a writer? Not just a writer, not just a reader. Okay? Then you have freedom when you write the word cat, but the part of you that's a writer loses freedom, while the part of you gains freedom as a reader, which may inspire you to write another word. The cat walks down the staircase. You've lost more freedom as a writer, but you've gained more as a reader that might inspire you to write more. And what if I told you that you ontologically are a writer/reader? Not just a writer, not just a reader. Do you understand? So you are always, as an entity, trading off between those freedoms, where when you're losing freedom of one, you're gaining freedom of the other. Likewise, if you're a mixture of nature and notion, as you are gaining freedom in notion, you are losing it in nature. And as you gain it in nature, you are gaining it in notion. And if you are both of those things simultaneously, that's where freedom comes from. Okay? So that's where freedom comes from. We are a reader/writer, both of them dialectically, but monistically because we're both. So likewise, we're nature and notion, and freedom comes between the interplay of the trade-off between those things. So that would be what Hegel, I think, would say.
But Daniel, I have to ask you, why is it that we don't entertain this option of incompleteness? Like, I'm just curious. Like, this is something that actually frustrates me about academia. Like, we never entertain this notion of incompleteness.
Because you can
go ahead.
Because you can only entertain it if you experience it, and in academia, you only think about it. It's an absolute, but not an absolution. Like, incompleteness cannot be entertained until you encounter incompletion, and that means you have to put yourself place somewhere where you're uncomfortable, like when you try to build a chicken coop and you can't. Then you go, wow, I don't know how to build a freaking chicken coop. And now there's the freaking extreme reality of I'm incomplete, and you have to now live with that, where if you stay in the ivory tower and always talk about building a chicken coop, you never encounter the reality that you can't. So I think the reason why academically we don't entertain incompletion, and if we follow Change the World, Randall Collins, what the colleges do spreads out into the society, we only treat incompletion as a notion, but not a nature notion that then forces us to tarry with the incompletion forever. Incompleteness at this point in society is an idea, but it is not an absolution.
This is why I distaste the idea of situationship, because they actually think it's this notion of incompleteness, but actually that's already a false ground. You're already on the notion of incompleteness. That's why the situationship does not exist. You're already on the notion of incompleteness. You have to decide. That's the whole point, in the midst of not knowing.
But this, you're pointing though at the danger of knowing the idea of incompleteness that leads you to believe that you know you're and living incomplete when you're not. This is actually the point that we're at right now, where like everyone knows that irony is like, you know, everything's ironic, but they actually use the idea of irony to hide themselves from the experience of irony. And so it doesn't move to the place of absolute being absolution. This is why I think this is why for Hegel, like the big moments are precisely like where you have the right ideas, but they're not experienced. You have the idea of absolute knowing, but it hasn't like encountered absolute knowing. This is what's so dangerous, because you genuinely believe you have done the work, because you have the idea of the work that is accurate. And so it's a very dangerous thing. And that's actually like the danger of postmodernism, for example, is knowing postmodernism without experiencing what postmodernism is saying and integrating that into yourself as a subject, and then saying, well, what does it mean that irony is the fabric of reality? Oh, it would unveil certain things and move to the affirmative. So I'm afraid the reason why incompleteness is a decoration on a Christmas tree almost is precisely because it is taught in a social institution that is allowed to keep it in the realm of the idea without moving it into experience. Ergo, it functions in terms of ideology preservation and enjoyment that is perverse. But with that, I fear I'll have to run. I've enjoyed this immensely. I'm glad we could talk about chicken coops, reading books, and free will, and Hegel, and dating. And Javier, +10, man. I'm very proud. That's wonderful. Again, you really need to tell the +10 that by making you anxious, by being younger than you, and asking you out, I have given you an opportunity to experience the loss of freedom, which is the affirmation of freedom. And that's what you need in this world that's constantly pressuring you not to believe that you are free. I have taken something from you and thus proven you had something to take. So will you go out with me? I think it's a great line. I think it worked really well. I really appreciate it. So, gentlemen, Everyone, thank you for your time. You're beautiful souls. Have a good one. All the best.